Welcome back to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. Hope, it is a pleasure to have you back on the show. And you sent me a DVD, a documentary that you made about a person I have never really heard of. And then I started looking it up, and apparently it's a big mysterious disappearance case that it just guess must have got chalked in the mix or must have missed one over my head or something. But do you want to explain a little bit about your documentary and then also when you came across Jim Thompson?
Sure. I don't ever remember not knowing about Jim Thompson, and that's because we were from the same world, the world of American expatriates in Asia. And so he was very, very famous, and he was world famous, but he was particularly famous in Asia. I grew up in Japan. He was based in Thailand. And not only did everybody know about him, but a lot of my parents, friends, and even my parents knew him. And so I'll give you some background. He was a very blue-blooded American. He was born in Wilmington, Delaware, came from a very wealthy family, went to Princeton, studied architecture at Penn, and he was supposed to just basically be a society, guy and, have a little bit of a career, but not do much. And what happened was during the 30s, he became very political and very upset about the rise of fascism in Germany and throughout Europe. And he quit his job in New York. And he had this wonderful job designing people's summer homes. He actually designed his own family's summer home in Rehoboth Beach while he was still.
That's where I was born, Delaware. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a beautiful house and it's still there. And he designed it before he ever went to architecture school. So he was very talented. There was a lot of artistic talent in his family. But he was just supposed to be a New York socialite. And he quit his job, and he joined the army. He joined the National Guard in Delaware first, and then he joined the army. And I think he was in the Signal Corps. And then when World War II broke out, he joined the OSS. And so he was a military intelligence officer, and he was
Spy.
stationed. What?
Spy.
Yeah, a spy. And he was very qualified for this because he was a well-educated guy and he spoke fluent French. So I think his wartime activities are still classified. But one thing and he didn't talk about it, but one thing we do know is that he wound up behind enemy lines in occupied France, and he was, probably a war hero. But because it was intelligence, we don't know exactly what he was doing. I imagine he was working with the French resistance. So after the war ended in Europe, it was still going on in Asia. So he volunteered for service in Asia. And he was sent to Catalina Island, where they did jungle survival training and paratrooping. So I think he was a trained paratrooper before because he'd been doing it in Europe, but he learned about jungle survival. And then he was sent to Ceylon, and he was in the same OSS group that Paul and Julia Child were in. And it was a very mixed bag in those days. I mean, I know during the war, they accepted all kinds of people into the OSS. They didn't ask for political affiliations, and he was very liberal. He had actually fallen out with his family because he came from a very Republican family, and he stopped talking to them. And this is before he left New York and quit his job and all that. He switched his party affiliation to the Democrats, and he was really kind of estranged from his family. And he got married, and then he went to war. So the way the war ended for Jim was he was already in Asia, in Ceylon, and he was supposed to parachute into Thailand. And they were actually over Thailand when they got the word that the Japanese had surrendered. So they flew back to Ceylon, and then a few weeks later, he arrived in Bangkok to become the station chief, the OSS station chief in Bangkok. And the Japanese were still there. They had surrendered, but they were still milling around. So he was there at the very, very end of World War II, which was in August of 1945. And he never went home. I mean, he went for business, but he stayed in Thailand. He decided he wasn't going to go back because his wife decided to not join him in Thailand because she'd been having an affair with one of his best friends. So she left him. And he was like, "What? Why do I need to go back? I don't have anything to go back for." So but he also couldn't stay in the army because the OSS was going to be changed, and it became the CIA in 1947, as you know. And it was very clear that they were not going to accept people like Jim because he was too liberal. And so he resigned his commission in 1946, and he was looking around for something to do. And he decided to work on the renovation of the Oriental Hotel, which is the best hotel in Bangkok. And he had a partner, a French partner, and they did things like put in plumbing, which they didn't have plumbing. I mean, that was how bad, but that was still the best hotel. So he decorated it and renovated it before that. And then he fell out with his partners. Then he really had to find something to do. And he decided that he was going to start a silk business. And that was interesting because silk wasn't a business. It was just something that people did at home for themselves, and it wasn't a commercial product. And so he decided that he was going to make it into a commercial product, but a very high end one. And to that end, he imported color fast Swiss dyes, which they didn't have. They were dyeing with vegetable dyes, which means that you couldn't wash the silk. And then he standardized the looms. He found a group of Muslim weavers in Bangkok, and they were a really impoverished minority because, they were out of the mainstream because they weren't Buddhist, and they were very, very poor. And he lifted them out of poverty by creating this system of you can weave at home and take care of your kids.
That's one of the liberal things I think you can kind of look at about him, and kind of what I've respected about a lot of his work. Like, I don't have a political affiliation, but if you look at it, he could have easily did a sweatshop and made his material thousands of times faster at a higher product value, but he decided to hire local populations of people and then also have them work from home. So, I mean, we all know from the pandemic that working home is kind of a bit of a luxury and a curse, but it was very effective in the sense that, I mean, he did revitalize the whole silk industry, at least brought it back up.
Well, it didn't, no, he didn't revitalize it. He created it because it wasn't an industry. It was just a home thing that people did for themselves. So it wasn't a commercial industry, and he made it into one. But what we think of when we think of Thai silk is entirely his invention. It was not that way. It was like very, very pale, faded colors. There weren't these interesting contrasts. So he had these color waves and and brilliant colors. And I'll show you, this is a good example. This is a stole that my mother bought when he was still alive. And you can see it's magenta and black, but they're all of these different patterns in it. It's like stripes and checkerboard pattern. And that was very typical of the stuff that he did. But it was all his invention. I mean, all of these, parrot green and azure blue and black and magenta and yellows, those were all his idea. So he was a brilliant colorist, and he also wasn't interested in making a mass product. He really did it for people who liked fashion and liked very lovely things, and had money. Frankly, it was like the carriage trade, because he didn't need money. He had family money, and also he didn't like money, and he didn't spend any money on himself. He wore horrible clothes, and he basically didn't care about food. All he cared about was antiquities and helping people through silk. I think the silk thing was actually as much of a sort of a project of his, kind of a social welfare project, because he raised these people up from poverty. And the way he did it was he would give them interest-free loans to buy new equipment, and then he would just buy whatever they made. He didn't pay them salaries. Everything was on consignment. But within a few years, they got really, really rich. And that's because his company, which was founded at the end of 1947, probably going into 40, no, I guess 1948, it never had a loss. It never had a down year. So from the first year, it was profitable. And he funneled the profits to the workers by giving them stock. So they went from being some of the poorest people in Thailand to some of the richest. And because they were Muslims, like they were sending their kids to college, and they were going to Mecca for pilgrimages. And it was amazing what he did. And that was what really mattered to him. And he was a true socialist. Um, and it's funny, I spent years researching his life, and usually when you dig deep into people's lives, you lose respect for them because you see that they, underneath it all, they were jerks. It was the opposite with Jim. He was even better than I ever imagined. And, at the end, I started thinking, this guy was kind of a saint. I mean, he was an amazing person, and he was incredibly selfless because nothing was about him. He liked to be surrounded by beauty, but it wasn't in this kind of, well, I'm going to, live the high life. He didn't, he just created things. So it wasn't just the silk. He revitalized Thai architecture. He actually created what we know as Thai architecture because it was dying. And he had this idea to put 5 Thai houses together to make a proper house. And it's now the second most visited tourist attraction in Bangkok. It's a museum, and it's filled with his art collection. So the third thing he did was to put Southeast Asian art on the map. And it really wasn't collected very much at all by non-Thais and non-Southeast Asians at the time. And he made it into this big thing. And all of a sudden people were, buying Buddha sculptures, and they were buying Thai paintings, and they were buying carvings. And it was this thing that he just did.
I know you mentioned before we even on our very first podcast, you mentioned that I like conspiracy stuff and I would find this one interesting. I wasn't so conspiracy with his disappearance. I don't believe a tiger got him at all. But I will say, do you think that's this type of personality that he has, this giving back to the community, but also trying to, I mean, he's not caring about the wealth. I mean, he's very ethical for a businessman. Let's just say that. Um, that he must have did something through his time in the OSS. Because usually when people experience something that's either really secret or really, really bad, they tend up having a change. Like, best example is the guy who was head of the MK Ultra project, Sidney Gottlieb. If you look at what he did when he kind of retired from all that drugging and testing on, experimenting on people, he was just right at a farm growing crops and writing poems and stuff like that. Like he was not anything that you depict this devil character. So I just was, that was my assumption with this change in this person. I'm not saying he did anything to that level, but I'm wondering if there was some type of experience or trauma that he had that caused him to be more about less materialistic in the sense of like things that would make you more rich and more thinking more into beauty, aesthetics, art, culture, more of this environmental stuff.
Well, I think he was always an artist. I mean, he was very involved with the Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo in New York. He was on the board. He designed costumes. So, the silk thing led right back into the New York thing. He was funded by Frank Crowninshield, who was married to a DuPont, and Frank Crowninshield was the editor of Vanity Fair. And he introduced him to Diana Vreeland, who was the editor of Vogue, and that's why the silk got into Vogue right away, but it also got into Broadway plays. So there was one called the Peep Show, and then the following year there was a little play called The King and I. And he did all the he didn't design the costumes, Irene Sharaf did, but he provided all the silk and also sort of collaborated with her on the designs. But that was when people started noticing Thai silk because every person in that movie is dressed in Jim Thompson silk. And then the movie came out, and then it became this enormous thing. And all of a sudden, Jim Thompson silk was in Buckingham Palace and things like that. But it wasn't that. He was never materialistic. He always wanted to make art. He always wanted to live this very aesthetic career. But I think the thing that led to his demise is that he was also a political creature. And because he'd been an intelligence officer, he knew things. And he always said, oh, I'm not involved in politics, and I haven't been, since the 50s. And it's true because he got really involved in Thai politics, and he decided that if he wanted to stay in Thailand, he couldn't kind of take sides. And things happened in the 50s that were really, really strange. The King Ananda, who preceded the more recent king, was mysteriously killed. And I think the idea was that he was poisoned, but this was in the early 50s, and there was almost a coup at that point. And the person who was blamed was a politician named Priti Panamiyong. And Priti was this incredible guy. He was a barrister. He was a foreign minister. He held a lot of ministerial posts, and they sort of implicated him in this plot. I don't think that he really had anything to do with it. But what was interesting was that he met Jim Thompson, and Jim really liked him because I think Priti was kind of like Jim. He was very well educated, and he really wanted to serve his country, and he had a lot of expertise, and he was also kind of a socialist because he wanted land nationalization. He wanted to change the system, and but not overthrow the monarchy. He wanted to change Thailand within the system, but it wound up getting him exiled a couple of times. And in fact, he spent a lot of his life in China under Mao, because he was a Maoist, apparently, although he did die later in the 80s. He died in Paris. So anyway, I think I have come to think that Jim's disappearance, which I'll go into, was related to Priti, because Priti was in China. He was stuck in China. He probably wanted to get out of China because who wouldn't, right? In the communist era, he wanted to come back to Thailand, and I think Jim was trying to get him back into Thailand, which would have created a real problem because Thailand didn't want him to come back. He never lived in Thailand after that. So it's funny because Jim always said when I left the OSS, I was never involved in Thai politics, particularly after this coup attempt in the early 50s when my friends died, some of them, and he decided he wasn't going to be involved in politics. Well, you can't do that. If you've ever been involved in politics, you can't kind of go cold turkey. So,
But you can't be involved in the OSS and then, just expect
right.
to
I mean,
retire.
you basically are a spy.
Well, did he use some of his connections with the OSS to get an interview with someone from DuPont to be able to get the Vogue magazine connection?
No, no, those were family connections because I told you he was from Wilmington, right? So Frank Crowninshield had married a DuPont. He grew up among the DuPonts. So there was a lot of money, and they actually, I think he got a loan from Frank to start the business, but it was like $6,000. It wasn't that much of a loan, but it got him going. But the main thing was that he already had those amazing New York connections. He didn't know Diana Vreeland, but he already knew Frank, and that was because of his family in Delaware. So he was a very well connected socialite, and it was very easy for him to launch his business because A, the product was amazing and no one else had it. And B, he already knew these people in New York. So he just went with a suitcase full of silk in New York. And then, the next thing he knew, he was on Broadway. The silk was on Broadway and the silk was in Vogue.
Well, like one of the top designers or fashion models or whoever sort of bought five.
Valentina was
Yeah.
right. She's not known today, but she was very popular in the 50s. So she used his silk a lot. So he was really able to launch this business in a way that other people wouldn't. But a lot of those connections he had from childhood, particularly the Delaware connections. And that was the Delaware money that really helped him. Yeah. So anyway, getting back, let me go through. Let's see. Do you want to talk about his disappearance, how he disappeared?
I do, but I also want to talk about the stuff before that when he was buying art and we took those trips and realized that he bought a bunch of possibly stolen material. And then he turned his house into basically an exhibit for people to be able to.
Right.
That's
Well,
very
it's
important.
that's kind of backwards because the house. So he built this amazing house, and it was finished in 1959, and it was his house, but it was like a museum because he had an amazing collection of Buddhist and Southeast Asian art, and and it was all arranged very beautifully. So people started asking him if they could come over and look at the art and bring their friends, and so it got to be such a big deal that he opened the house to the public one day a week, and then he gave all the money to a charity for the blind. And so that was the situation while he was still alive. And it was actually the situation when I first visited the house, which was in it was in 1967. It was this the year he disappeared. So he disappeared in April. I was there in December with my family. It was my first trip to Thailand, and I was 8 years old. And my mother had already told me I had to find out what happened to him because it was this earthquake that hit the expatriate community. People were terrified. I mean, even in Japan, they were terrified, but everybody knew that something had gone horribly wrong. They didn't think he had fallen into a tiger trap or gotten lost or something like that. They knew he'd been murdered. And it was such a big deal that, people who knew him, who were close to him in Thailand, who were Americans and Europeans, actually left. They left because they were afraid to be in Thailand because they didn't know what was going to happen to them. They don't know what the reason was, but they weren't taking a chance in being murdered. So they left. And even in Japan, it was deeply, deeply disturbing because I said, for years and years and years, anybody who went to Thailand met Jim. And the reason was they would go shopping at his store. And sometimes he was often there. But it wasn't just that, he would entertain at his house every night. And the reason he did that was that the American ambassador hated entertaining. And, that's part of the job, right? So he deputized Jim to do it because he didn't want to have a party all the time. And people were always coming through. So almost every night of the week, he would have people over to his house for dinner. And, he never went to any trouble. He didn't care about food. So he just have the houseboy go buy like street food, really bad street food. And no one noticed because they were having such a good time in his house. I mean, it was so magical. And it's one of these houses that it's not nice during the day, but it's really fantastic at night. And I was lucky because I got to film there at night. You don't get to go there at night when you're just a tourist. So you never really see the house the way it's supposed to be seen, which is with candlelight and, all of this diffuse light bouncing off these beautiful teak walls and highlighting the art. And so that was what he did. So he was like Mr. Bangkok, everybody met him. And then all of a sudden he had vanished. And people thought, well, he'll turn up and, something will happen. And nothing happened because the people who knew what happened never talked. They never talked. And that's why people suspect the CIA because, if it had been just criminals, somebody would have talked.
When he disappeared, that was on Easter, was it?
Yes, April 2nd, 1967.
And a lot of the suspicion came because he said he was going for a walk and he left his jacket, he left his cigarettes because he was a chain smoker, and he left his kidney stone medication,
Gallbladder medication.
gallbladder
Yeah, he
medication.
was not in great health. I mean, he was only 61, but he was not in great health. And he wasn't in Thailand. He was spending Easter with his friends, the Lings, a doctor, and I can't remember his husband's name, but Helen Ling was his friend, the wife, and she was an antique dealer. So he knew her from the fact that, he spent a lot of time buying antiques. And they were based in Singapore, but they had this beautiful cottage in the Cameron Highlands. And the Cameron Highlands was this resort where people went to get away from the heat. And it's up in the mountains and it's really nice and kind of like, a little slice of England, these beautiful cottages, gardens. And at the time, there was a lot of dense jungle around the resort. So, there was golf and there were, lawns and things like that, but there was also jungle. And so Jim went for Easter Sunday, Easter weekend, and it was weird because he had been acting very strangely in Thailand, and I'll get back to that afterwards. But when he came up to the Cameron Highlands, they were just going to have a quiet weekend. And he decided that on Easter Sunday, they should go for a picnic. And this was all his idea. And it was like 45 minutes away from the house. It was, driving. And he chose this spot with a beautiful view and he arranged everything. And they went there. And the minute they got there, he was like, I think we should go home. I don't want, and he would rush and he didn't want to go. at the outset, he decided that he didn't want to go. And Helen said, "That's ridiculous. You planned the whole thing. We're going." And then once they got there, he rushed everyone through lunch. And he said, I want to go back to the house. And then he went back to the house and he said he was going to lie down and take a nap. And everybody, lay down and took a nap. And then a short while later, they heard him walking along the gravel path away from the house. Why would he have done that? And the weird thing is, I found out afterwards, he not only did he leave his cigarettes behind, and this is a chain smoker, right? He left a burning cigarette behind. He didn't even stub it out, which means somebody came to the window and he had to go. And, he knew. So I knew the whole thing was weird, because why would somebody not take their cigarettes, their lighter, their medication, nothing, and just walk away? And then the prevailing idea at the beginning was, oh, he got lost in the jungle. This is a trained jungle survival military officer who was also a paratrooper. He didn't ever get lost in the jungle. He knew how to find his way out. And, he knew how to survive in wilderness and in jungles. So that was a ridiculous idea. And then they had this other thing where, he was killed by tribesmen, or, I mean, really, it's strange credulity, because this is a guy who was trained in the military. But it's very clear he was meeting somebody. It's very clear it was arranged. And I always thought, well, why didn't he just not go to the Cameron Highlands? If he knew that this was going to be trouble for him, why did he go? And apparently it was something that he could not get out of. And whatever it was, whatever conversation he was going to have, he couldn't have it in Thailand. And that it still seems very strange to me, because if I were going to be killed, I'd rather be killed in a city, with witnesses, than in the country where nobody would see it and nobody would be able to solve the crime.
Well, do you believe he's dead, or that was him being killed, or do you believe it was a meeting point to go escape somewhere else? I think it's
No, no,
his
no. I
niece
believe
believes
that he
that he
was
went to China.
killed. He was met by somebody and he was instantly killed. And because if he had been, in an accident, or an animal had gotten him, they would have found something. They never found anything.
Well,
They
that's
didn't
why
find any fabric.
his niece believed that he went to China and escaped and just went somewhere to a different location. I mean, if you're meeting with someone, you meet with one person, you meet alone, and then they take you somewhere, like the coyotes
Don't.
that drag people through the borders.
Why would he have gone to China though?
Why wouldn't he? If you're
He
trying
didn't
to
want to go to
escape,
China. Nobody, because China was a closed country at the time. I mean, Pridi was there because he was exiled pretty much, and he had to find some place to go. I don't think he could have stayed in Paris, although Paris would have been a better bet. But I don't know. Maybe France didn't want him because he was too much of a hot potato. But he wound up living in China, and in those days, when you were in China, you were stuck. You were stuck there. So I don't think. I mean, maybe he could have wanted to go there to get Preeti out, but I don't think he would have done that. There wouldn't have been any point for him to go there, because he would have been recognized. He was a tall American in a country where there were, at that point, very, very few Westerners. So there was no, I mean, it, could he have been kidnapped? Well, when you're kidnapped, there's always a ransom demand.
yeah, but the fact they looked for 11 days and didn't find anything.
Oh, it was weeks. It wasn't 11 days. It was weeks. They did major searches. That's what I'm talking about. That he wasn't, dragged by an animal, or, he didn't fall into a ravine or anything like that, because they didn't, there's always evidence after something like that happens. You find a little scrap of clothing, or you find, belt buckle, even if you don't find any bones, but usually you do find bones, right? They never found anything, because he was executed and they took his body out of the Cameron
But
Highlands.
but nobody saw that. Nobody saw that
No,
there
but
was.
what they did see is there were witnesses who saw a convoy of military trucks going up into the Cameron Highlands on Easter Sunday. Why would they have done that, right? And I heard one of my other interviews that after the fact, I met a woman named Catherine Bodenstein, and I had never heard of her, but she lived in Los Angeles, and she was a friend of Jim's, and she was the one who confirmed to me that he had told her that he was a Marxist. And I had never heard that from anybody else, because he really, and the reason he told her that was that she was too. So they had that bond. But she said she was in Thailand right before he disappeared, and he was acting like a crazy person. He was so nervous, and he was completely unlike himself. And she said, "What's going on? What's wrong with you?" And he was just frantic. And he said, "I'm worried about because he just built a new store, beautiful new headquarters." And he said, "I'm worried about the blacktop in the parking lot." And she was like, "That can't be it." And he was kind of like not himself. I mean, he was definitely not himself. He wouldn't socialize. He wouldn't go swimming, which he always did every day. He wouldn't have lunch with her. He wouldn't do anything. And he was frantic. And
Well, it
at the end
sounds
of
like
that
somebody
week,
was definitely after him. I'm just trying to figure
yeah,
out.
at the end of that week, he had planned to go away for Easter. That was a plan. It was actually in the newspaper, back when they used to print little social things, and they said, "Oh, Jim Thompson's going to the Cameron Highland with his friends, the Lings, for Easter weekend." And so it was a planned trip, but the point of the trip was not to spend Easter with his friends. It was to have this meeting. And I'm sure it was a meeting with more than one person, and it had to have been about something top secret. And who knows, maybe it was something to do with the Vietnam War. I always thought it might have had something to do with the secret war in Laos. He really cared about Laos, and Laos was absolutely destroyed by carpet bombing. And I think he would have wanted to stop that and to get involved somehow. He might have initiated the meeting. But the thing is that, the CIA had a huge file on him, and a lot of it is still redacted. You can request it through the Freedom of Information Act, but I didn't see any point in it, because it wouldn't have told me anything that I didn't know. But they had been following him around for years. I mean, they kept track of his affairs and everything.
You mentioned it
Um,
in your film, which was when you were interviewing one of the guys. I can't remember his name, but he mentioned about having a disagreement with Mr. Thompson about Vietnam. Obviously, they had different opinions and different views on being there.
well, Murray Fromson, I think he was a journalist, and I don't really remember. Didn't watch his interview again, but
You
I think
interviewed a
it was
lot of people. I'm very impressed by
yeah.
it.
I went all over the world for those interviews, because this is the thing. All of my interviewees in that documentary are dead now. So I'm glad I got to them when I did, except for Jim's nephew, Henry Thompson, who is like 98 years old, but all the rest of them are dead. And one of them, the Charlotte Horseman, the only one who said on camera that he was murdered, she died months after the interview. And it was very brave of her to say, because this was the thing. It had been decades since his disappearance. At that point, it had been 35 years since he disappeared. And yet people were still afraid to say that it wasn't just an accident. I mean, especially in Asia, everybody lied on camera, including people who said privately that, of course, it was a murder. They wouldn't say it on camera because they didn't want to get in trouble with the Thais. It's a very sensitive issue. My documentary has never been shown in Thailand. And in fact, his company, who was very helpful and let me film and gave me photographs, once they saw the documentary, they disavowed it. They didn't want to have anything to do with my documentary, because it was real. I don't know why I told them it was a documentary, but I think they were expecting some sort of, romantic
Fluff piece,
docudrama.
fluff piece.
And I never had any support from his company, which was extremely awkward, because I was counting on that. So I was forced to sell the documentary to an uncaring audience in the United States. I couldn't get anyone interested. Nobody cared in the United States. And his family didn't get behind me, because they're very fractured. And of course, he was estranged from a lot of his family. And I would hear from different branches of the family, but it's funny, because his family, to this day, there were branches that don't talk to each other. So, I couldn't count on them. And so my main following is in Europe. I mean, the people who really care about Jim are the French. So I have a big following in France. And in Europe in general, it's an interesting story that a lot of people know about. But in America, people are like, who cares? I've never heard of this guy and I don't care about, it's part of the American, I think, xenophobia where, when you go overseas, people don't care about you. And, I come from a family of expatriates on both sides. And my father was a colonial, a British colonial. His grandfather went to China and made his fortune there. But, once you leave Scotland or England or wherever, they don't care about you anymore. And you're just out of it. You're out of the society. So I kind of feel this the same way with America. Jim left America and did everything that was really important to America overseas. I mean, he should have been celebrated for what he did with silk and what he did with for the war. But people don't even remember him. I mean, most people would say, "Oh, you mean the writer Jim Thompson?" No, I don't mean the writer, the pulp fiction writer Jim Thompson. I mean, to me, Jim Thompson is the Silk King, which is why I called my documentary Jim Thompson Silk King. And he was this amazing person. But it's very hard to get Americans interested in history, and I say this as somebody who was a historian. It's not a popular subject, which is kind of why we're in the situation we are in politically, because people don't read history.
I
But
just posted a clip about that today, and I didn't know it was actually around the time period of the 1970 Kent State shootings. I had posted about the protest on Kent State campuses, and then everyone's like, "It's crazy what's happening today." And I'm like, all right, let's not relate the two, but there is obviously history is doomed to repeat itself over and over again when we don't choose to learn about it. But out of all the people you've interviewed, any theories or ideas or speculation from different family members of who and why? I've seen so many, and I'd like to bounce some off of you, and you can just verifiably knock them down if they're not authentic. But I'm curious to the people you interviewed who gave you an idea, whether it was on camera or off camera.
well, the most disappointing interview I had was my main interviewee, who was William Warren, who was Jim's biographer. And in his biography, which was used to be called The Quiet American, and now I think it's got a new name. I think it's Jim Thompson, The Untold Story. He says very specifically in the book, he says that he didn't fall into a tiger trap, and he doesn't come out and say he was murdered, but he definitely points in that direction, and he implies it very strongly that it was not a normal disappearance and he didn't want to disappear. Why would he have disappeared? He was at the height of his career. He just opened a new store and the business was gangbusters. So anyway, Bill said all this stuff in his book, and then I thought he's just going to repeat what he said in his book in my interview, and he said over and over again in the interview, it was an accident. It was an accident. Well, that's not what he said in the book. But, he spent his life in Thailand and he didn't want to make the Thai authorities angry. I don't know why the Thais would take it personally. It didn't happen in Thailand. And there's no clear evidence that the Thais were involved. But at the time, I thought they were because it's such a sensitive topic. It's really, really.
Well, it can cause an international incident if you blame the or
It
the
was an
yeah.
international incident, but there was no blame on the Thais. Although Jim had some issues about his art collection, and he'd had some things confiscated, which they said were stolen. He had bought stolen property.
That's where I think their connection is. I don't think it's the art guy who is anything to blame, but I think that was a setup. I think that
Oh,
that
that was totally a setup, and it's a red herring. Also, it has nothing to do with his disappearance. It did have to do with the fact that he was angry with the Thai authorities for seizing his incredibly beautiful limestone Buddha heads, which honestly, people, it's very hard to establish provenance of something that was found in a cave. You know, he didn't go into the cave and get it. He got it from an antiques dealer who said it was legit. So I don't think that he was at fault, but they made it into this big thing, and he was very bitter. And he stopped collecting Buddha images after that, and he started collecting Bencherong porcelain. So he had a new thing to get into because he was so turned off by the Buddha head incident, but it had nothing to do with disappearance. I mean, I don't really think that. And then they also people also said ludicrously that people were jealous. Other people had gotten into the Thai silk business, but they were jealous because he was more successful. Well, he was more successful because he had a better eye. He had incredible color sense, and these other people didn't. Um, that's not a reason to kill somebody, because the business was fine. It continued without him. He didn't have to be there, although it continued in a more mass market direction, and it's different now. They don't make stuff like the stole that I have anymore, but they do make fabrics for the home that are very much like what Jim designed. But the clothing fabric is not the same as it used to be. It's not as good.
What did his nephew say about his disappearance?
He didn't really talk about it, and it was very hard for me to get him to stick to any subject. I mean, he was just like ADD. He would start talking about fish, and how you can't get a decent piece of fish anymore. I mean, it was the worst interview because he could not stay on any subject, and he was not a linear thinker. And I don't think it was because he was afraid. I just thought it was kind of a gaga interview, which is what's amazing to me, that he's still around, because I didn't think he was destined to live to a great age, because he was a terrible interviewee, and he couldn't organize his thoughts. And this was in 2000. No, I think it was 1999. Yeah, it was the same year. So it was the same year I filmed in Thailand. I interviewed him, and it was super difficult to get anything out of him. But he didn't talk about his disappearance. He didn't have any ideas, or if he did have ideas, he wasn't going to share them with me.
Do you think the family was scared because of the fact that wasn't his sister dead at like was it a couple days
Yeah,
later
but
or a few
that
weeks
was
later?
a true red. That had nothing to do with his disappearance. It was just coincidental, because she was found murdered in her farmhouse in Pennsylvania, and it turned out her son did it.
Damn, this is all around me too. Holy shit. I'm right in
Yeah,
Maryland. I was born
yeah.
in
Well, her
Delaware.
son, you can look, I have a picture of a family picture, and her son looks like it's like something out of The Shining, at the end, you know,
Oh,
where Jack
wow.
Nicholson looks so scary. That's the way her son looked. And, he had a grudge against her. And that explains why, she had dogs, and the dogs didn't bark, because why would they? They knew him, he was a family member, but yeah, he killed her. And it's pretty, and they were going to prosecute him, but he died. I think he killed himself.
Yeah,
So
he
he
killed
died
himself.
before they could prosecute him. So, but the thing is that all happened within a year of his disappearance. So I think it was the following year that she was killed. And so that just led to this deepening mystery. And it seems very scary at the time, but it's not connected.
Okay.
There was really no, and she wasn't even the sister that he was close to. I don't think she was an older sister. He was very close to his sister, his younger sister, Eleanor, who was also, she was a landscape architect, but he wasn't close to his other siblings. So the sister who died was, I think, his eldest sister, and he had not had much to do with her in years and years.
Who was the best interview you had, or experience wise?
Well, actually, it's funny. I think the probably the best interview I had was with Catherine Bodenstein, but that wasn't for the documentary because I hadn't met her then. So that was years later, and I did that as a DVD extra. But in the main documentary, I I think in a lot of ways it was Charlotte Horseman, the woman who actually came right out and said he was murdered, because you know she was at the very end of her life. I mean, she died a few months later, and she had nothing to lose, but she was living in New York. She would have probably said that even if she'd been living in Hong Kong, which was where she was based. But I just appreciated the fact that she didn't beat around the bush or play games with me or waste my time. Like another one of my interviews, Andre Burroughs, was this woman who was madly in love with Jim, which was weird because she was married, but her husband was also kind of in love with Jim, I think very much so. and they were obsessed with him. And she would tell me this stuff about Jim off camera, but she would never say it on camera. And the worst part was that she made me come to her house, and she said, "You can't bring a crew. You can't bring a camera crew." I'm like, "Wait, I need a crew." And she was like, "No, you can't. You have to come alone." I said, "Well, can I bring my son?" And she said, "That's okay." So I brought my son, who was a teenager at the time, and he shot the interview. So he wound up doing a lot of the interviews because we just started working together on them, because this woman was so freaked out. She didn't want anybody, she didn't want to do the interview anywhere but her house in the countryside in France. And she didn't want to have anybody listening to this stuff. So I thought, oh, well, she's really going to dish the dirt. She's going to tell me stuff that is top secret. She said nothing, and she drove me crazy. And we thought we weren't going to get out of there because they didn't want us to leave. It was like we were trapped. They wouldn't let us
It's
leave.
so
And
scary.
finally, like I said, we've got to get back to Paris. And we called a cab, and we lay awake all night so that we could escape before dawn, before these people tried to make us stay another day, because she dragged it out. So she would only sit down for like an hour a day. And then she'd say, "Oh, I'm tired. I cannot talk anymore. It is too hot." And then it would be another day. So it was this nightmare situation. But it's funny because I've done a lot of interviews with old ladies, and she was the worst, obviously, and she was the most conniving. But I've had a lot of issues with games, and makeup and hair issues where they don't like the way they look, or they renege, they try to renege on the interview when you get there. I've had that happen too on two documentaries. I don't know what it is, but you can't make documentaries without old ladies, because they're the ones who are still around. They were the witnesses, and you got to talk to them because they have first person accounts, but God, they make it really
I
hard.
should give you the footage I got for my JFK documentary.
Yeah,
Maybe you can
yeah,
actually
it's
do
really
something with
annoying.
it.
I mean, I think, I love interviewing people, and I think I'm good at it, but I don't appreciate the games that I've had to deal with. And, I mean, I've had people try to back out of the interview when I got there, you know, and and it's just unbelievable to me that people would agree to an interview. I fly overseas to get the interview, and then they decide they don't want to do it. And then I have to play all kinds of games and, with them and try to persuade them. I had an interview here where the woman wouldn't sign the release until I did the interview, edited it, and showed it to her. And the joke, and so that cost me a lot of money because I didn't know whether I was going to be able to use it. And I had to pay my editor to get it in ready condition. And the joke was she had macular degeneration and she couldn't see the interview. So she put me through the ringer for months. And then she finally signed the release, because if you don't sign the release, you can't use it.
Well, being so closely involved into this, what I guess has been the most upsetting to you out of popular culture when people do talk about the Jim Thompson case?
I don't know that so I used to get upset that they only cared about his disappearance. And now I get upset because um people waste my time. And they're not the people who are interested in the disappearance. It's people who are doing their own projects. So they want to make a feature film, or they want to write a book, or they want to do their own project, and they wind up contacting me, and I try to help them, and then they take my footage and won't give it back, or they give me a hard time, or they have a feature film project that they abandon. And I swore I wasn't going to go down this road again, because this has been, I've gone through this like 4 times, where they want to get me involved because they want to option my documentary, and they want to make a feature film, and it never happens. And so I go to these meetings, and I have to read their pitches, and I have to look at their book and all that kind of stuff. And they're like, "Well, we decided it's too hard. We're not going to do it." I'm like, "Thanks for wasting my time, because the only reason I was helping you was that I thought I was going to get some money out of this." I didn't do it purely out of altruism, although I do get involved because I want it to be accurate. But, I mean, this last group of producers who came, they were pretty far along in the development process. I mean, they had gotten a lot of stuff together and they were very, very serious. I said, okay, I'm not going to meet with you unless you're really serious about it. And it was during the pandemic. So I think we did a Zoom and then they just bailed. And I'm like, God, I can't believe they fooled me again. I can't believe I went through this.
Why do you think that is? So many people bailing out of it.
I think, most film projects, feature film projects that get started never wind up being a film. For some, either they get really far along and the financing falls through, or they were just fishing to begin with. But I don't appreciate wasting my time on this stuff because it also drags me back. It's been 25 years now. That was my first film, and I've got other stuff going on. So even like I had to watch it again last night. I didn't watch the whole thing, but I had it was interesting because I hadn't seen it in years, and I I was really happy with it. I mean, there were times in the intervening years where I wasn't as happy with it. I thought, oh, I wish I'd done it differently. If I'd known then what I know now, I would have done it completely differently. But this time, it's been so long that I watched. I was like, hey, this is really good, particularly for a first film that I did all on my own. I mean, I did everything but the editing and the main camera work and sound on my own. So I directed, I wrote, I produced, I did years of research. And then then I thought, well, I'm done now. So in 2001, I thought I was done. It never ended. I mean, I just things kept happening. People kept contacting me. I kept getting new information, and it just his people remember Jim. People still talk about him. I mean, my parents' generation is mostly gone now, but until their dying days, they would get together and say, "What do you think happened to Jim?" They always talked about it. So my mother always, my mother's still around. She's 103. And, she always thought something was going to happen. But the funny thing is, I told her, well, you told me I had to find out what happened. And that's why I eventually made this film. And she's like, I don't think I said that. Well, she did. Because, how else would I have done it? I mean, it was something that really had an effect on me. And also going to Thailand the year he disappeared was very, very significant because I got to see his house when it was closed to the public. And I also got to see his silk weaving because at that point, everything was woven in Bankura right across the Klong, the canal from his house, and in that Muslim neighborhood. And it was magical. I saw that they were washing the silk in the Klong or in, and then hanging it up to dry on these piers, and the sun just caught the silk and it was so bright. I was kind of blinded by this bright light and the colors and the quality of the silk. And I thought, I'm never going to forget this. I mean, it was really one of the seminal experiences of my life. I didn't know I was going to become a filmmaker, but I really wanted to do this because I felt that somebody had to, and no one was going to. I mean, everything else that had been done up until that point was made up stuff. It was just filled with lies. And I wanted to make an accurate documentary that actually told the truth about him and wasn't based on some fantasy or fiction. And, it was a labor of love. I mean, I'm glad I did it. And, but, I certainly didn't make any money off of it. so,
Did you
so,
see
and I
did,
continue not to make money off of it, although
did
people still buy it.
did you see why he fell in love with the place in the first place?
Yes, because that's the thing. I'm glad I went then because Bangkok is not the same place now. I mean, it's very changed.
Yeah.
And the thing that's most changed about it is it used to be, called the Venice of the East. And it was called the Venice of the East because it had all these beautiful canals running through the city. And they were magical. One Sunday we took a boat along this canal that was known for its Sunday market. And people lived there and they were swimming and brushing their teeth in the Klong, and they were also peeing into it and going through in boats with bananas on them, that kind of thing, and selling handicrafts and fruit and vegetables from their boats. And it was so beautiful. And most of them, there were still some canals. I mean, there's one in front of Jim's house, but a lot of them have been covered over and drained. And now Bangkok has flooding. because the water's got to go somewhere, so they eliminated a lot of canals and now they've got floods. And it's just a concrete jungle compared to the way it used to be, except for Jim's house, which is preserved. And I mean, they've built they've built kind of a big museum onto it, and a meeting hall and a restaurant, but it's still there and it still looks the same. And then that neighborhood that he used to weave in looks the same, or it did when I was there. But the weaving had been moved to the northeast, to a town called Pak Tong Chai, and we went there and filmed. So it's an actual factory now. So it's not, people aren't weaving in their homes anymore, but it's still a pretty nice factory.
Do you believe, based on the views that he was developing, if he was a so-called Marxist, that a lot of the old OSS or CIA members might have considered him a security risk?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Because he gave an interview just 2 weeks before he disappeared, talking about and it was never aired. It was kind of a background interview for, I think, for CBS. And it's in my documentary. And he talked about, he refuted the domino theory. I don't think he ever believed in it. I think Murray said that he did, but I don't think he
Yeah,
did.
Murray said he did, that that's the
Yeah,
same
and
guy.
then but in that interview he says, he doesn't talk about the domino theory specifically, but he talks about the fact that the Thais did not want to be colonized, and he felt very strongly about an independent Thailand, and it really had not been colonized, and that's what makes it so different from all the other countries in Southeast Asia. So he wanted America not to be involved in Thailand the way it was involved in Vietnam. Um, and um, he didn't talk specifically about Laos, but I'm sure he felt very strongly about American involvement in Laos. But I think that he disagreed with
Nation,
American policy.
look up American involvement in Indonesia. You want to talk about the guy who was the head of the OSS and then eventually a head of the CIA, his involvement in Indonesia with the Rockefellers? Ooh, that's the death of Dag Hammarskjöld for you. The UN General Secretary that was making the peace mission. The only one that has been investigated by the not the United Nations, yeah, United Nations 13 times. They have not closed his investigation on his death. There is still an open case onto it if you look at it
I
today.
remember, yeah, yeah. It's kind of suspicious, the fact that he died in a plane crash.
Yeah, well, I mean, he had an ace of spades in his pocket. You can see the photos of that. But there's a lot of things, whether it's the resistance fighters down there shot down his plane, or whether, I mean, someone messed with the altimeters on the plane and even a slight little adjustment on that had him headed right into the tree line. So that could be J. Edgar Hoover. And that's interesting because in the latest one that came out in 2019, they put that in the report. They said based on J. Edgar Hoover's reputation has largely diminished over the years, that there's a possibility that there could have been some FBI collusion. And that's in there. They don't make any conclusion saying this is 100% final. But I mean, if we're talking about conspiracy stuff, there is like real gold and all that involved in Indonesia. That was a gold mine, and making a peace deal over there is a giant problem for people that have financial interest invested over there. And that's what I thought about with the Thailand stuff. I was like, is there a financial interest in the whole silk business that he could become a threat in
No,
trying to?
not, it wasn't financial. It was political.
Okay.
It was political because there was no, and it was political in a weird way because, as you know, Thailand's a monarchy, right? And so Thailand thinks of itself as a modern democracy, but it really isn't, because it has lèse majesté laws, which means if you insult the royal family, you can be imprisoned. I mean, do serious prison time for it. And the insult is very amorphous. I mean, the whole idea, like, what constitutes an insult? I mean, sometimes it's like somebody putting up a flyer of, that's nothing, not advocating a coup or anything like that, just mildly critical of something that's going on in the government, and they can be jailed for that. And so it's a very strange kind of system because it kind of wants to have it both ways. It is a parliamentary system. So, they have elections and all that kind of stuff, but they've got this royal family that they protect very, very strongly. And it's just kind of an odd situation. And then, as with a lot of countries in Southeast Asia, the same powerful families go cycle in and out of government. I mean, Laos is hilarious because it's the same family, the same group of families, and they just switch party affiliations as necessary. So, like, during the more communist era, like they were communists, and then they became, Democrats or whatever. I don't know what the system is now, but they don't really see party affiliations as important because the most important thing is that it's these families, these powerful political families that hold power no matter what. And that's very Asian. I mean, that's very Chinese, particularly. Like, I remember um, uh, uh, Lee was asked if, because China has free markets, and he said, now that China has a free economy, um, will you call it something else? Will you call the system something else? And he said, whatever we kind of government and economy we have, we will call it socialist. So, it's not if they were a true socialist country, they'd have a command economy, but they don't. So they think they can have an authoritarian socialist government and have a free market economy. And the fact that you can't is pretty obvious today. That's the cause of China's situation. You can't have a free economy and not have freedom of speech and freedom of expression for the people. And so it's a constant tension in China, and it's not going to end well. I'm telling you, they're going to have to do something to lighten up on the people if they want to, keep them working.
I love it how you think like that, because I don't think like that at all with China. I don't see their government giving a crap about any of their workers. Their oppression is doing
No,
just
they
fine.
don't. They don't give a crap, but they're going to have to change their system and stop believing that they're a socialist country when they're really not. They
I
have
don't
all
think
the
they
problems
actually
of a
believe
capitalist
that.
country.
I don't think
No,
they
they
actually
don't. It's
believe
very
that.
cynical. The thing is that when people think, oh, China's going to be this and that, what you have to realize about China is that in all of its history, it's had a lot of different kinds of governments. It's had emperors, and it's had communists, and it's had anarchists, and it's had warlords. But in every system of government China has had, it has always had an authoritarian regime. So they don't know. I mean, this is the thing when people say, "Oh, we're pro-democracy," like, you don't know what democracy is. And I've seen this where when Chinese people come here and they see what democracy really looks like, they can't deal with it. It's too messy for them. They're like, "Oh, people are so unruly here." Well, that's the reason we have a democracy, or that's the cause of democratic society. And they don't like that. I remember when I went to China in 1981, I just graduated from college, and I was asked by my guide what job I was going to do. And I said, well, I don't know. I just graduated and I haven't found a job yet. And the idea that I had to go out and look for a job and actually find a job on my own scared the shit out of him. I mean, he was just like, he almost passed out. He was so afraid of the whole idea of having to do this, because in China at the time, the government told you what job you were going to have, and it was all arranged for you, and they like that. So they want that. They want that kind of big brother thing when it works for them, and they don't want the big brother thing when it doesn't work for them. But now what's happened is that people are on their own economically in China, and they have to find jobs. And they're on their own. Housing prices have really gone up. You don't get a free house anymore. So they have all the insecurities of capitalism and none of the benefits.
Well, what did you kind of come to the final conclusion on, obviously, on who kidnapped him or who killed him, and why that killing happened, and why we have documents that are still redacted?
Right. I honestly, I think it might have been a joint effort.
Okay.
I think and there might have been some Thai involvement. Maybe they didn't want him around, but I don't think anyone could have actually performed this successful a hit job except the CIA.
Okay.
I really it's the only explanation. I don't see the
They got a
Malay
track record,
government.
so
Yeah, I don't see the Malay government being able to do it, or and what would have been their motive. The Chinese couldn't have done it. I think it really had to do with, I think it had to do with Vietnam in some ways. I think Jim knew what was going on in Laos. I think he knew what was happening. Maybe he was going to blow the lid off of that. I don't know. Maybe it really did have to do with the fact that he wanted to smuggle Pridi out of China. But, someone in the CIA was involved, and which makes it really sad because, he obviously knew people in the CIA. He was still connected. He was probably still gathering information in Thailand, because most foreigners overseas wind up being informal sources for the U.S. government anyway, if they're American.
That's how they use
So,
journalists
he,
in the
he
Cold
might have
War.
been involved in intelligence gathering, but he must have done something. And the thing is that obviously he knew things were not going well. I don't think he expected to be killed. I think that he expected something bad to happen to him, some consequence to his behavior. I don't know, but why would he have gone? Why would he have been so nervous? And why wouldn't he have just fled? That's the thing. People thought for a long time people would see, they thought they saw him. Like they'd go to Tahiti and they thought they saw him there. They were in an airport somewhere in Europe and they thought they saw Jim. The problem is Jim Thompson looks like everybody at the Princeton reunion. I mean, he's a very common type in America. He's a wasp. He's a balding wasp. I mean, I see people who look like Jim Thompson all the time, but no one ever confirmed it. And, obviously they just saw people who looked like him, and he was never seen again. I mean, I fully believe he died that day, April 2nd.
Well, Hope, I really appreciate the time that you've given me to do this podcast. I appreciate the research that you have done and still talking about it all this time later as well, too. Um, and I appreciate you sending me the DVD. I'm gonna have to watch the extras that you
Yeah, and
mentioned.
I'll try to find some more pictures if you want to, use them, intersperse them. I don't know where I have wonderful pictures, his, archival pictures of his house and things like that. I just can't find them, so it's problematic, but they're in the documentary. But I really hope, and also my documentary is available online. It can be streamed on Vimeo. I can sell DVDs, hopeandersonproductions.com. I still sell this thing, and because it's historical, it doesn't go out of date. So anyone who's interested can get a DVD and watch it for yourself, and definitely watch the DVD extras because there's more up to date stuff on them. But I really do hope that I find out more, but there hasn't been anything definitive, more information. And the thing is that his file is still redacted, so I don't know. No one ever talked on his deathbed, that's for sure.
Well, I'm gonna link all your links in the description. Hope, it's been a pleasure chatting with you again, and thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for our next episode.